The water of the Tiber is not clean. It has never been clean. For centuries, it has served as Rome's great artery and its great sewer, carrying away the filth of a million lives, the refuse of empire, the blood of its enemies, and sometimes the bodies of its own. On a bleak day in March of the year 222, it was tasked with a new burden, a piece of imperial refuse so despised, so utterly rejected by the city he had tried to rule, that even the earth would not hold him. They had tried to stuff his corpse into a sewer, but the conduit was too narrow for the slight, 18-year-old frame. The act itself was a final, pathetic humiliation. He had been emperor of the known world, a living god in his own eyes, and now he was common sewage, too large to be flushed away. So they dragged him out, the boy Emperor Elagabalus, his body pale and bloodless, and with him the body of his mother, who had been slaughtered while trying to shield him. The mob, a howling congress of soldiers and citizens, tied ropes to their legs and pulled them through the streets they had once paraded down, their progress marked by a slick of mud and gore. The final destination was the Emilian Bridge, and from its height, they were thrown into the murky, indifferent water. The river accepted him. It swallowed the boy who had called himself a god, the priest who had tried to make Rome his temple, and carried him towards an anonymous oblivion in the sea. This was not merely an assassination, it was an exorcism. It was the violent and visceral rejection of a foreign body by an organism that could no longer tolerate its presence. How does a 14-year-old boy, hailed as a liberator and the scion of a beloved dynasty, become so reviled that in 4 short years, his own guards would murder him in a latrine and desecrate his corpse with such methodical fury? The story of Elagabalus is often told as a simple morality play, a lurid tale of a depraved tyrant, a monster of sexual deviancy and religious mania who deserved his fate. The Roman historians of the era, Cassius Dio and Herodian, paint a portrait of almost cartoonish villainy, a figure so consumed by decadence that his reign becomes a catalog of absurdities. But this is the history written by the victors, by the regime that needed to justify the slaughter of a consecrated emperor and his mother. The truth is infinitely more complex and far more tragic. It is not the story of a monster, but of a child raised not to be a Roman emperor, but the hereditary high priest of a strange and potent god in a far-flung corner of Syria. It is the story of a catastrophic cultural collision, of what happens when the deepest convictions of one world are violently thrust upon another that is unwilling and unable to understand them. The tragedy of Elagabalus is the tragedy of a boy who believed he was bringing his god to the capital of the world, only to discover that the world and its capital would rather destroy him than worship at his altar. To understand the Emperor Elagabalus, one must first forget Rome and travel east to the ancient city of Emesa in the Roman province of Syria, and the hereditary high priest of this cult with a family of one Julius Bassianus. His descendants, through his daughters Julia Domna and Julia Misa, formed one of the most powerful families in the East, a dynasty of priest-kings whose influence would soon engulf the entire Roman Empire. Julia Misa, an ambitious and formidably intelligent woman, had watched her sister, Julia Domna, become empress as the wife of Septimius Severus. She had lived at the heart of imperial power, and after the assassination of her nephew, the Emperor Caracalla, and the subsequent brief and unpopular reign of the usurper Macrinus, she saw her chance to reclaim that power for her family. Her instrument was her grandson, a boy named Varius of Vitus Bassianus. He was just 14 years old. He had spent his entire life in Emesa, steeped in the world of the temple. He was not a politician or a soldier. He was a priest. From his earliest childhood, his reality was shaped by sacred ritual. He would have led processions, danced in a state of religious ecstasy before the black stone, and worn the opulent silken robes and elaborate jewelry of his office. To the people of Emesa, he was not just a priest. He was an incarnation of the divine, a beautiful vessel for the power of his god. He was handsome, with the striking features of his Syrian ancestry, and possessed a natural charisma that was inseparable from his religious role. This was the world that formed him, a world of absolute spiritual authority, of vibrant and demonstrative worship, and of a direct, personal connection to a god who was not an abstract concept, but a physical object of immense power. He knew nothing of the Roman Senate's stern traditions, the delicate dance of military politics, or the austere, contractual nature of Roman religion. The mos maiorum, the ways of the ancestors, which valued stoic duty above all else. Julia Maesa, a master of political theater, began her campaign. She moved her family to a military camp near Emesa and started a rumor, a potent and brilliant lie, that her grandson, the beautiful boy priest, was the illegitimate son of the beloved, murdered Caracalla. To soldiers who were already disenchanted with the tight-fisted Macrinus, the story was intoxicating. This boy was not just anyone. He was a Severan, a link to a dynasty they revered. Maesa reinforced this lie with the most compelling argument of all, gold. The vast wealth of the Temple of Elagabalus was open to the legions. Bribed, inspired by the boy's supposed lineage, and perhaps even awed by the mystique of this charismatic young priest, the Third Gallic Legion declared him emperor in May of 218. They gave him the name of his supposed father, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. The name the world would remember him by, Elagabalus, was initially a term of mockery, linking him forever to the foreign god he served. The forces of Macrinus met the boy's newly loyal legions in battle. During a critical moment when his troops began to falter, the 14-year-old emperor, or perhaps his mother and grandmother, rallied them to a shocking victory. Macrinus fled and was soon captured and executed. Suddenly, impossibly, the high priest of Emesa was the undisputed master of the Roman world. From his perspective, this could only be the will of his god, Elagabalus, who had proven his supremacy and now deserved to be honored in the capital of his new empire. The journey from Syria to Rome was long, and it was during this slow procession westward that the first deep cracks in his reign began to appear. Elagabalus did not travel as a Roman general or a statesman. He traveled as a priest on a sacred mission. He delayed his arrival in the capital, spending the winter of 218 in Bithynia, and it was from there that he made his first catastrophic political miscalculation. He commissioned a full-length portrait of himself to be sent ahead to Rome. But it was not a portrait of a Roman emperor in armor or a toga. It depicted him in his role as high priest, dressed in flowing silks, his eyes lined with kohl, his cheeks rouged, and his neck and arms laden with necklaces and bracelets. He was offering a sacrifice to the black stone of Emesa, which was prominently featured. He commanded that this painting be hung in the Senate house, directly above the statue of the goddess Victory, so that the senators, when making their traditional offerings to Victory, would in effect be making them to him and his god. The reaction in Rome was one of profound shock and horror. The Senate, a body of grim-faced aristocrats who prided themselves on their stoic masculinity and adherence to tradition, was being commanded to pay obeisance to a portrait of an effeminate, bejeweled boy worshipping a meteorite. It was a declaration of war on everything they held sacred. His grandmother, Julia Maesa, who understood the rigid Roman mind far better than her grandson, was appalled. She had engineered his rise to power, but she was quickly discovering that the divine will of a 14-year-old was far harder to control than the loyalty of a legion. She tried to mitigate the damage, to present a more Romanized image of the new emperor, but the boy was intractable. His power, his very identity, was inextricably linked to his god. To compromise on his faith was to compromise on himself, to deny the very force that had, in his mind, placed him on the throne. When he finally entered Rome in the late summer of 219, he did so in a procession that was more religious than triumphal. The Romans who lined the streets saw not a conquering hero in the mold of Augustus or Trajan, but a strange, exotic spectacle that filled them with a mixture of fascination and deep unease. He was an alien presence at the heart of their world, and he had no intention of assimilating. He had come not to be Romanized by Rome, but to Emesize the Romans. The central, all-consuming project of his reign began almost immediately. the religious revolution. Elagabalus was not content for his god to be merely welcomed into the Roman pantheon. He intended to make Elagabal the supreme deity of the entire empire, to subordinate all other gods, including the mighty Jupiter Optimus Maximus, to his own. On the Palatine Hill, the most sacred ground in Rome, overlooking the Forum, he began the construction of a magnificent temple, the Elagabalium. This was not just a new building. It was a deliberate act of appropriation and sacrilege. To consecrate this new holy site, he ordered the most sacred objects of Roman religion to be moved there. The eternal flame of Vesta, the Palladium, the shields of the Salii, the very talismans of Rome's survival and divine favor, were to be torn from their ancient homes and installed as mere attendants to his black stone, which he had brought with him from Emesa. To the Romans, this was an act of spiritual violence, a desecration that threatened the Pax Deorum, the peace between gods and men, upon which the safety of the state depended. The revolution did not stop there. In a move that displayed his complete misunderstanding of Roman sensibilities, Elagabalus decided that his god needed a wife. He arranged a sacred marriage, a hieros gamos, between the Black Stone and Pallas Athena, whose revered statue he had carted over from its temple. When he felt this union was not prestigious enough, he annulled the marriage and sought a new consort for Elagabal. His choice fell upon the goddess Tanit, the celestial Juno of Carthage, a powerful Punic deity whose cult statue he had brought to Rome with immense ceremony and expense, levying a special tax on all of Italy to pay for the dowry. He celebrated the wedding of his god and his new divine bride with citywide festivities, forcing the populace to participate in rituals they found bizarre and offensive. Each year, at the summer solstice, the Black Stone would be placed in a jewel-encrusted chariot and paraded through the city from the Palatine Temple to a second suburban shrine. Elagabalus himself would run backwards before the chariot, his eyes fixed on the stone, his every movement a display of ecstatic devotion that the Romans viewed as undignified and deeply un-emperor-like. While the city reeled from these religious provocations, the political and social fabric of the empire was also being torn apart. Elagabalus showed no interest in the mundane tasks of governance. He did not consult the Senate, which he openly despised, and he neglected the military, the very foundation of his power. Instead, he filled the highest offices of the state with his cronies from Syria and a cast of characters chosen not for their ability, but for their loyalty to him or, according to his detractors, for their physical appeal. A charioteer named Hierocles, a Carian slave with whom the emperor was infatuated, was given immense power and influence, referred to by Elagabalus as his husband. The command of the Praetorian Guard was given to a dancer. Other crucial administrative posts were filled by barbers, actors, and couriers. Cassius Dio alleges, with dripping contempt, that appointments were often decided by the size of a candidate's genitals. While this is almost certainly hostile propaganda, it reflects the perception of a government run on whim and debauchery, completely detached from the Roman ideals of merit and public service. The emperor's personal life became a source of unending scandal that horrified Roman society. He married and divorced 5 women in 4 years. His first wife was a noblewoman, Julia Cornelia Paula, whom he cast aside. His third was Aeneia Faustina, a descendant of Marcus Aurelius, whom he took after executing her husband. But his most shocking union was his second marriage, to a Vestal virgin named Aquilia Severa. The Vestals were sworn to 30 years of chastity. Breaking this vow was a capital offense, traditionally punished by being buried alive. For an emperor, the Pontifex Maximus, the chief religious official of the state, to not only sanction this, but to be the perpetrator of the sacrilege was unthinkable. Elagabalus, however, justified it with a chilling, alien logic. He declared that it was fitting for him, a high priest, to marry a priestess, and that from their sacred union, godlike children would be born. To the Romans, this was not piety. It was blasphemy compounded by treason. Julia Misa watched this escalating disaster with growing terror. The dynasty she had fought so hard to restore was being destroyed from within by the very boy she had placed on the throne. He was a force of nature she could no longer guide. Her attempts to counsel him, to urge moderation, to persuade him to at least perform the public duties of a Roman emperor, were met with adolescent petulance and fanatical self-assurance. He was the emperor. He was the priest. His will was the will of his God. Who were they to question it? She saw the hatred coalescing around him, in the silent, resentful halls of the Senate, in the grumbling barracks of the Praetorian Guard, and in the streets where the people now openly mocked him. Her political instincts, honed by a lifetime of intrigue, told her that the situation was untenable. The structure was about to collapse. If the Severan dynasty was to survive, Elagabalus had to be neutralized. Her solution was both brilliant and ruthless. She had another grandson, a cousin of Elagabalus named Bassianus Alexianus, later known as Severus Alexander. He was the polar opposite of the emperor. Raised under the careful supervision of his mother, Julia Mamaea, and Misa herself, Alexander was groomed to be everything Elagabalus was not: modest, serious, respectful of Roman tradition, and interested in military and civic affairs. He was the perfect Roman aristocrat. Misa began a campaign to promote him, presenting him as the stable, respectable alternative to the erratic priest-king. Her plan was to have Elagabalus formally adopt his younger cousin as his son and heir. This would, she hoped, placate the Senate and the army by providing a guarantee of future stability. It would also transfer the aura of imperial legitimacy to Alexander, creating a viable replacement should the worst happen. In 221, under immense pressure from his grandmother and mother, Elagabalus reluctantly agreed. In a public ceremony, he adopted his 13-year-old cousin, who was given the title of Caesar. The move was an immediate success, but not in the way Elagabalus had hoped. The Senate and the soldiers showered Alexander with affection and respect. They saw in him a return to normalcy, a savior from the bizarre religious tyranny of the emperor. For Elagabalus, this was intolerable. He had been forced to share the divine spotlight, and now his understudy was receiving all the applause. Consumed by a venomous jealousy, he began to see his young cousin not as his successor, but as his rival. The paranoid logic of a boy who had been taught he was a god on earth took over. He realized that in creating an heir, he had also created his replacement. The emperor's paranoia spiraled into open hostility. He stripped Alexander of his titles and spread rumors that his cousin was dying, hoping to test the loyalty of the Praetorians. The reaction was volcanic. The guards, who now viewed Alexander as their future emperor and meal ticket, erupted in near mutiny, demanding to see Alexander alive and well. They refused to perform their duties until both Elagabalus and Alexander appeared before them at the Praetorian camp. Terrified, Elagabalus was forced to comply. He rode to the camp in the imperial carriage with his cousin beside him, a humiliating journey that starkly revealed who now held the real power. This event sealed his fate. He had tried to eliminate his rival and had failed, exposing his own weakness and confirming the Praetorians' protective devotion to Alexander. From that moment on, Elagabalus was a dead man walking. He made several more clumsy attempts on Alexander's life, each one further enraging the soldiers and strengthening their resolve to protect the younger boy. Julia Misa and Julia Mamaea, seeing the writing on the wall, abandoned Elagabalus completely and threw their full support and their formidable wealth behind Alexander. They were no longer preserving a dynasty. They were staging a palace coup. The final act came on March 11th, 222. Sensing the tide had turned irrevocably against her son, Elagabalus's mother, Julia Simias, convinced him to go with her to the Praetorian camp one last time to try and quell the open insubordination. It was a fatal error, a lamb walking into a den of wolves. As soon as they entered the camp, the soldiers loyal to Alexander, who had been primed for this moment, separated the emperor's supporters and began to murder them. Chaos erupted. Elagabalus and his mother fled, seeking refuge in a latrine, the most squalid and undignified hiding place imaginable. But there was no escape. The soldiers burst in and found the Emperor of Rome cowering in the filth. Julia Soaemias threw herself over her son, a final, futile act of maternal protection. The soldiers showed no mercy. They hacked her to death, and then they fell upon the 18-year-old boy. His reign, which had begun with the promise of divine favor, ended in a bloody, ignominious slaughter amidst human waste. The murder itself was not enough. The hatred for Elagabalus was so profound, so visceral, that it required a ritualistic cleansing. His body, and that of his mother, were not afforded the respect due to even a common citizen. The soldiers and the mob that joined them began a grotesque, post-mortem parade of vengeance. They dragged the corpses from the camp and, through the forum, the very heart of the city he had tried to reshape. It was a spectacle of ultimate degradation. The populace that had been forced to witness his religious processions now witnessed his humiliation. They jeered and threw refuse at the lifeless forms. The attempt to stuff his body into a sewer was the ultimate symbolic statement. He was not a fallen emperor, but human pollution to be expunged. When that failed, the final act of rejection was carried out. From the bridge, he was consigned to the Tiber, denied a tomb, denied a place in Roman soil. His name was officially erased from all public inscriptions under a damnatio memoriae. The Senate, emboldened by his death, formally condemned his memory and ordered his religious edicts reversed. The black stone of Emesa, the silent, impassive cause of all the turmoil, was unceremoniously packed up and shipped back to Syria. The Elagabalium was reconsecrated, rededicated to Jupiter the Avenger. The old gods were restored to their temples. The eternal flame of Vesta was rekindled in its rightful place, and a collective sigh of relief passed through the city. The new regime, with the now 13-year-old Severus Alexander as emperor and his mother and grandmother as the true powers behind the throne, worked swiftly to erase the stain of the previous 4 years. They commissioned the histories that would define Elagabalus for millennia, painting him as a singular aberration, a foreign disease that Rome had successfully purged from its system. This official narrative was brutally effective. It transformed a complex cultural and political crisis into a simple story of a perverted monster, making his murder not a regicide, but a justifiable act of liberation. For nearly 2,000 years, this has been the dominant legacy of Elagabalus, a caricature of Oriental decadence, a footnote in the history of imperial decline known only for his bizarre religion and alleged sexual excesses. But in the modern era, a more nuanced picture has emerged. Historians now question the relentless hostility of the primary sources, recognizing them as propaganda designed to legitimize a violent coup. We are forced to ask, were his actions truly born of malice, or of a profound, unshakable, and ultimately fatal piety? Was his alleged sexual fluidity a sign of depravity, or was it a reflection of the androgynous nature of Eastern priesthoods, misinterpreted and sensationalized by a rigidly patriarchal Roman elite? We cannot know for certain. The boy himself was silenced, his perspective buried under layers of slander. The story of Elagabalus is not merely about a bad emperor. It is a cautionary tale about the absolute limits of power when confronted by the immovable force of cultural identity. He held the title of emperor, but he was never truly Roman. He was, until his last breath, the high priest of Elagabalus, and he fundamentally believed that what was sacred to him should be sacred to all. He tried to impose his personal reality onto an empire, and the empire, in its turn, reacted with the brutality of an immune system attacking a foreign pathogen. He was a teenager given absolute power, surrounded by sycophants and manipulators, and set on a collision course with a civilization whose values he could not, or would not, comprehend. His reign stands as a testament to the fact that an emperor could not simply command faith, and that the gods of Rome, ancient and jealous, would not be so easily unseated. In the end, we are left with that haunting final image, a body sinking into the brown water of the Tiber, the river that defined Rome, that had witnessed its foundation and its glories, became his final, unmarked grave. It was a symbolic end for a boy who had remained a stranger in his own capital. He had tried to bring the god of the mountain to the city of 7 hills, but the hills and the river and the people who lived between them refused him. The water closed over his head, and with him sank the dream of a Syrian god ruling the Roman world. All that was left was a desecrated memory and a chilling lesson on the catastrophic price of being a god in the wrong heaven.